Sydney FC had one of the most star-studded player lists in A-League history this season, yet they failed to qualify for the A-League final series. Their marquee signing, Douglas Costa, he played at a World Cup with Brazil. He's a 3 times Bundesliga champion with Bayern Munich and a 3-time Serie A champion with Juventus. They had Joe Lolly, the English Alex Tobin medal winner from the previous campaign. And there's the Brazilian Leo Senna at the base of the midfield, who only a few years ago was earmarked for a $17 million transfer. There's Patrick Klimala, an instant improvement on Fabio Gomez, finished in the top 5 in the Golden Boot race, and Adrian Segacic, the off-the-bench specialist who won the Golden Boot, plus so many more contributors and great players across the season. So how did a club with such a talented squad, one that most had tipped to be the runaway title favourites at the beginning of the season, perform so far below expectations in the league? Defence was always an issue. Fatigue from Asia doesn't help, and a line ball selection decision in goal are the obvious factors. Does that really explain a fall all the way outside of the top 6? Elsewhere, Melbourne City wrapped up their place in Asia for next season as the A-League finals bracket is locked in, with Adelaide United somehow staggering over the line in spectacular fashion. Western United announced their new ownership, A-League crowds are up again, and the Scudetto in Australia. Interesting proposition on this episode of the Round Ball Australia podcast. My name is Jacob Stevens, again taking over hosting duties. Lockie's off sick again today, unfortunately, but I am joined by 2 fantastic regular guests of ours. First of all, Christian, how are you doing?
Not too bad. The only word I heard in that intro was Scudetto. I'm like, oh, okay. I'm awake now.
Any mention of anything Italian and Christian's immediately on the ball.
I cannot wait to discuss it in more detail towards the end of the show. It'll be good.
And Poletti also joins me tonight wearing a PSG shirt, I'm sure just to antagonise myself with the upcoming Champions League fixture against Arsenal later on this week.
Yes, I plan to antagonise Lockie as well, but he's, I tell you what, he's not sick. He's bailed on us. He's big no to this. He gets one co-commentary gig in NPL Victoria, and he's suddenly too big to do this podcast. I commentate every week for Football New South Wales.
Strong
I'm
words.
here. Like, I don't big note anyone. I'm doing ground announcing. It's great, but, you know, this has been an incredibly fun week in Australian football. We had some cracking A-League games across both the men's and the women's competition. But my favourite moment from the weekend was about 10 seconds in length in the MacArthur FC game. Now, I missed this live because I was at the ground and I was having a discussion with somebody else when the line was uttered, because we did have the TV broadcast on in the commentary box with commentary, but Jacob, you brought it to my attention. And it was Simon Hill, after Daniel McBreen mentioned something about afterburners, Simon Hill going like the Roadrunner, to which Daniel McBreen went meep, meep. And I just think it so perfectly sums up Australian football. It takes itself not too seriously. We're in the middle of a massive derby. You wouldn't get this in England. You wouldn't get this in Italy. Just, a moment of hilarity, probably unintentionally so on the part of Daniel McBreen, who probably just went on instinct. In the middle of an intense derby, the Wanderers need to win, build momentum going into the finals, and you just get a wonderful line like that. And so to you, Mr. McBreen, meep, 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 meep indeed.
That was a pretty good moment, and I had to double check when I first heard it. I was like, "Is that what he really said?" And I went and rewinded it. Thank you very much, Paramount Plus, for the rewind feature, by the way. Listen to it, and I was like, "That's definitely what he said." So that was a great moment. But it was another side in Sydney that I sort of stole the headlines this week with what has been just one of the biggest falls from grace I think we've seen recently in the A-League, maybe only in competition with Adelaide this season in that regard. That's, of course, the Sky Blues, Sydney FC. Coming into the season, expectations were really high, Christian, right? They had semi-finals under Tale in 23-24, despite a poor start. But they, coming into the season, they significantly improved their playing squad. Obviously, Douglas Costa was their marquee signing, but they had the likes of Klimala come in as well, Leo Senna, like I mentioned. And they got off to a really good start as well in the Asian Champions League too. But then sort of just strayed from that a little bit, right? They never really got firing in the league, but they then exited out of Asia in pretty disappointing circumstances against Lion City Sailors. And I think a lot of people would have thought that top 3 or 4 would have been the absolute minimum expectation for them this season. So falling out of that was disappointing, but missing the finals altogether is disastrous. And it's something actually that the club themselves have acknowledged. The CEO, Mark Aubrey, came out in an open letter to supporters and said, "We had very high expectations and didn't deliver. And we know you expect better and feel let down by this result." And while it's all well and good to have those things said publicly, it doesn't really change the fact, Christian, that they massively underperformed this season.
For sure. I mean, fans would be extremely disappointed given those signings you mentioned in the off-season, right? Like, there was just so much hype and expectation, and for good reason, right? I mean, Douglas Costa was obviously the standout marquee, but then you had obviously those pieces around him like Leo Senna. He was, built up as supposed to be this really good midfielder. This Brazilian talent that could probably pull the strings, and you had all these pieces coming together. And we were talking about it sort of in the preseason before the A-League season started, when they were starting their campaign in Asia, right, where it seemed to gel and click really well, and you thought, okay, there's really no excuses here to get off to a fast start domestically and potentially try and challenge for first place, right? And I think most of us, if not all, had Sydney at least in the top 2, right, in our predictions.
Yeah.
But to finish in 7th, and just that game against Melbourne City on the weekend, to concede 5 goals, and the performance they put in just showed, I don't know, a sign of lifelessness. Like, the finals is on the line, right? I know Melbourne City were playing for something in terms of ACL Elite, and obviously that's massive for them, right? For that club, the amount they've invested. They were at home, yes, but it just seemed as though Sydney would just ran out of gas. And I understand they played multiple competitions this year. City didn't, but at the same time, I didn't expect this struggle because of the amount of depth they've got in the squad, right? You saw, the amount of players that be able to bring off the bench. Kachowski, for example, came on and scored a couple of goals. They had all these bits and pieces, right, coming off the bench. They could provide a bit of an impact. And that's why it becomes so surprising, right? So, I mean, fans obviously have a right to be angry, disappointed, whatever emotion they feel, right? Because obviously they expected finals football. They expected a championship. They expected silverware. And what makes it worse is semi-finals in Asia and the ACL too. That was basically a platter, right? Hey, Sydney, go on and make the final. It's literally there, right? Considering all what happened with San Frecce, right? And all the drama that happened with Jermaine, right? So, a lot of things just didn't go right for Tale, and it begs the question, why did they sign Tale on before knowing whether they'd make finals or not? Because now they're in this predicament where they've got to back the manager. He's signed a new deal. They've got to go through all this off-season of questions as, is he the right man for the job? Whereas they probably should have reevaluated and reassessed their options post-season, right? When they knew the ultimate outcome, whether they'd make finals or not. So, because that performance against City showed me that perhaps some players just aren't on the same wavelength or the same page as perhaps we may have first thought.
And it's really strange, right? Because it seemed like they kind of did have that 6th spot locked up. And only a few weeks ago, we probably would have said there's no hope of Adelaide making it. And I know I definitely said that. And MacArthur by that point had fallen away as well.
We know. You said it more than once. We know.
You've got the receipts.
That's right. But it really was Sydney's spot. And all they needed from those last 2 games was a single point. And, Christian, I think you put it quite well there. In this game against City, they just looked lifeless. And Poletti, you're obviously based over in New South Wales. On social media, at least, it seems Sydney fans are in complete uproar about all of this. Do you think that maybe we just set expectations too high, or is it reasonable that, this was a dramatic underperformance and that they really need to do better?
There's no doubt in my mind that this goes down as the latter. It is an absolute underperformance. I mean, there is a reason that people who are much smarter than I am basically had Sydney locked in to win everything, right? I don't think, like, on paper, this was a massive squad. I mean, if Sydney FC announced tally at this point, because it's not announced yet, we have to remember that it's only been
Yeah.
reported by, the likes of Vince Regari and James Dodd that they've agreed to terms. Nothing has been announced yet. Look, if for whatever reason Sydney FC do announce this deal with Tally, 2-year deal, there's going to be hell to pay from the fan base, because I know social media isn't the be all and end all, but there'll be a lot of people who are not happy with the decision to bring him back, particularly after they've missed finals. Like, and something we might talk about a little bit later with another coach, that may or may not have been playing their trade in France quite recently. Missing finals is a sackable offence. At some clubs, getting knocked out of the cup is a sackable offence at some clubs. So, for a club that is top 3, top 2, maybe in the country, you have to be doing better. Finals is almost a bare minimum pass mark for the season. And you can write all the letters that have been vetted by marketing candidates all you want. And that's not to say anything against Mark Aubrey. I've met Mark. He's an absolutely fantastic person. But, letters only do so much, because at the end of the day, when you see what's happening on the field coming to this, it's not good enough. And this is probably a gripe that I have a little bit more in general with the way that these CEO letters go out, because we've seen a few of them now as seasons have ended. This was just a poor season by Sydney FC in general across the A-League Women's program as well. And yet the A-League Women's side only got like 2 or 3 lines in the piece. So, it's that's a different story entirely, which, I'm sure is that if you want to hear more on that, tune into the Dubcast.
You got it early this week.
There's going to be a lot of ranting this week, and I'm sure it's not going to be the last time I plug the Dubcast this week. But, it's not good enough for Sydney FC. I don't know. I know we've got a section put out for Tally a little bit later, but I'll pose this question to both of you now: Who is available? Which I think is the other question. It's who would be available to take the helm that hasn't coached recently at the Western Sydney Wanderers. I don't want to say his name.
Well, that is the big thing, right? Is you've got to look at the market and what's available, and like you mentioned, it's really only at the moment speculation that he's been signed on for 2 years, and there is the possibility that there's a condition on making finals, as you said, Poletti, for a club that has aspirations, or it admits to itself being one of the biggest clubs in the league, being a top 2 club in the league. Not making finals is a huge deal for it. It's a huge deal for some of the smaller clubs in the league as well. So it is a bit of a strange one, and I would be surprised if there wasn't anything there. But no, it's a good question that you raised, though. Who is out there? And I mean, Robbie Stanton? I don't know. Like, there's just not.
Stanton was in charge of the academy for a long time, so Stanton comes back. I mean, Mark Jackson has said he's prepared to tender his resignation if things don't improve. Does Jacko do better?
Would Sydney fans be happy with that, though, taking a coach like Jacko, who's maybe not had the best of seasons this season himself? It's definitely.
I mean, you
one
look
of
at
those
the
ones
resources that are available at the Mariners. We're
That's
talking
true.
I mean, Mike Charlesworth wants to hand back the license at the moment, if reports are to be believed. Like, you've got a coach who's shown that he can do it at a smaller club. This is Sydney FC. This is Manchester United. This is one of the biggest clubs in the country. Give him the resources and he'll thrive. Thank you to Josh Parrish for that. He's had it stuck in my head since I've listened to the NPL Victoria podcast. But that's just this is one of the biggest clubs in the league. If you give someone like Mark Jackson the resources to thrive at a Sydney FC, we've seen what he can do with the bare bones. What can he do when he's got the resources there?
Well, and that's an interesting point, right? Because you can't point to a lack of investment from the club as being one of the reasons why they've not performed, right? Really good signings in the offseason. I think we're all agreed that the players that they brought in have been tremendous additions for them. The two Brazilians, Leo Senna and Douglas Costa, have been obviously instrumental, even though Costa's been injured at times. He's still been fantastic. So, Christian, it sort of then becomes a question of, so what was the reason why they didn't perform so well, right? So obviously they had Asian football, fixture congestion, fatigue from that. Something that Aubrey actually noted in that letter. He said that without making excuses, the burden of this season's Asian campaign did take its toll physically. And while we are proud to go further than ever before, out-league form has not produced what we expect. So it's very hard to compete in Asia and the league in the same season. We know that. But, it kind of just feels like another excuse to add to the fire. Obviously the defense was another thing. They, were always open in defense. They were conceding a lot of goals in transitions. It was really their Achilles heel this season. And, there was sort of a reluctance, I think, perhaps from Ufuk Talay to try and make wholesale changes there to try and figure things out. They brought, was it Alex Grant in January, and even that didn't really shore things up. Alex Popovich looked lost in the second half of the season. And then obviously the goalkeeper as well. Devonish Mears was sort of handed the reins pretty early on in the season and given the backing. And it was a really long-term play where a lot of teams were still juggling keepers every week, making changes depending on mistakes. Tale said, no, I'm going to back one keeper and hope that he comes good. And, people have been critical of him, especially in the back half of the season, but I think maybe forgetting a lot of the mistakes that Redmayne made at the start of the season that put him in that position anyway. So, yeah, it sort of begs the question of, is it just, do you think a combination of all of these things adding up? Do you think one maybe more than the other, Christian?
Probably. I mean, firstly, you can't blame Asia for those poor performances, right? Because you saw last season the Mariners, their budget, the squad depth, they won the treble, right? You can't tell me that you're going to use that as an excuse. I'm just not buying it. So, especially with the talent they've got, the resources, they should be doing so much better. It's not even funny. And probably to your point about the defense, I'd probably lean towards more of that factor because, like you mentioned, I mean, the likes of Popovich who came in, the rotation with the goalkeeper, Ryan Grant's getting a year older as well. Like all these factors and just contribute and snowball effect into them shipping a lot of goals, especially in transition as well, where Tale just didn't seem to find the right formula. And when you play around so much with the back four or the back five, even at times, it's very difficult to find some cohesion and consistency right throughout a whole season, especially when you're juggling multiple competitions. He was trying to rest players, trying to find different solutions that just frankly didn't work. So you can afford to make those experiments in the front third, in the midfield even, but in the defense, when you make so many wholesale changes, it's very difficult to try and find that right balance, right? And Sydney, they found that out the hard way by missing finals, by underperforming in Asia when they should have reached the final at a minimum, considering the bracket that they got dealt with. This is going to be a very bitter pill to swallow for the Sydney board, the manager, the players, and most importantly, the fans.
Yeah, it's a really difficult position for the club to find themselves in, I think, and an incredibly disappointing thing. And it is that defense, right, that was leaky all season long. And there's a great stat by Andrew Howe that he came out with on Twitter earlier this week. Sydney FC are the first side to finish in the bottom half of the table while scoring more than 2 goals a game, and that's in A-League men's history, which is just crazy, right, Poletti? Because that's sort of what Sydney, like, we expected this season. We're like, they're just going to score goals and it's going to stamp their authority on games. And yet it just feels like it didn't happen often enough. They had a couple of, especially in the derby, we saw what they can do when things go right, but it just felt like they couldn't get things together. So, is it maybe then that Tale's just incapable of getting the best out of the players? Are we being too harsh on him? Is there something more there, do you reckon?
I think that is a little bit too harsh of a statement to make. I think that, like Christian said, I'm not buying the travel as an excuse. The Mariners had to not only go to Asia and they won. But they also had to go to a lot of different places that Sydney FC wouldn't have dreamed of going this year.
Yeah.
I mean, they went to Central Asia. Did the Mariners? Like where did Sydney FC go? They went to Japan. They went to Korea. They went to Thailand.
Singapore.
Like that's like as far as travel in Asia goes, that's pretty easy. Like it's not anything too bad. And I know they're flying economy and all of that, and we saw the photo of Alex Grant getting stuck in a middle seat, all 6'4" of him. At that point, I might have quit the club if I got stuck in the middle seat. But it's like, but I mean, it's not the end of the world. Like the Mariners had a lot worse to deal with, so I don't buy that as an excuse. But I mean, they let Luke Bratton go, who was just driving that midfield last year. Yes, they had some injuries to deal with, but like, did anyone really expect Douglas Costa to play all 27 games plus or 26 games plus everything in Asia? Of course not. There's a reason that someone like him is available to the A-League, right? It's because he's not at his best anymore. He can still go and he's still, top 10 player in the league on a good day, but, there's a reason that players like that become available to the A-League, right? Daniel Sturridge, Juan Mata, who, had 10 minutes of football in the previous 18 months since he came here this season, like, I think it's being a little bit too harsh on Tale to say that he couldn't get the best out of his squad, because I think there were hindrances in place, particularly the departure of Hayden Matthews from an already poor backline. But Jacob, and I think this will give you a good transition as well into the next thing on our rundown. I believe there was another half of that Andy Howe tweet that you just seemingly glossed over. I believe there was another half of that.
Well, I picked a bit out that was relevant to the conversation we were having at the time, but you're right, there was another part to it. The flip side of the story, of course, is that Sydney's downfall has been a blessing for Adelaide United, who it looked like were done and dusted this season. We're in a title fight at one point, only a couple of points behind Auckland, had that amazing 4-4 draw away in New Zealand, where it sort of felt like maybe it was going to be a preview for the grand final, and then just fell and couldn't put anything together. It was 9 games without a win, and yet still have made finals now. Like I said, Sydney just needed 1 point from the last 2 games. They couldn't do that, so Adelaide snuck in by a point. And yes, you're right, Poletti, the other half to that stat is just as hilarious. So Adelaide United is the first side, not just in A-League history, but in Australian men's league history, to finish in the top half of the ladder, conceding more than 2 goals per game at 2.12 per game.
Madness.
Which is just
crazy.
That's absurd. That means that to get a point from a game, the team has to score at minimum 2 goals a game, which, I mean, they've managed to do for the most part. Obviously, Archie Goodwin tied Golden Boot winner with Adrian Segicic, which a great story in its own right, having these 2 20-year-old Australians at the top of the Golden Boot list. But yeah, Christian, it was maybe Adelaide counting their lucky stars that Sydney couldn't get the job done there, despite what's been a pretty poor season from them.
I mean, who would have thought, right? A few weeks ago, they were on an 8 or 9 game winless run. We thought, okay, the wheels are just completely fallen off. Jacob, you were writing them off, despite you were pessimistic all season, so that doesn't really mean much coming from you. But
yeah, I was going to say, didn't Jacob write them off before they'd even played the Australia Cup?
Yeah, I believe Jacob said Adelaide would win the wooden spoon, I think. But yeah, anyway. But I mean, it's just a case of they've just created their own luck, right? Because the first half of the season, let's not forget, they performed really well and they took us by surprise. And ultimately, that's what's happened, right? The amount of points they picked up during that little stretch and period has helped them, propel them just ahead of Sydney. Yes, a bit fortunate that the Sky Blues, look, they should have finished it off because they sort of had it in their hands, right? They just needed to get that 1 point and they couldn't capitalize, to their own fault. But I mean, Adelaide, yeah, again, to their credit, I think it's that unity, right, which I was impressed with the first half of the season at least. We've seen it dwindle down a tad. And then obviously with Carl Viet's comments post-game in the final game of the season a week or 2 ago has sort of, it has made it a bit awkward now coming into this elimination final against West United, because from that perspective, how do you, again, galvanise your squad and build them up for this big game, right? Elimination final, do or die. Loser goes home. It's massive, right? So I think, look, it's going to be interesting how he approaches it and how the Adelaide players respond. But I mean, looking at Stefan Mork on the weekend,
Yeah, I was going to
inviting all
say.
the players over it was pretty funny, and obviously it means something to them, doesn't it? To
Yeah.
have them all around watching the game in anticipation whether they'd make finals or not. So obviously they want to send Calviert out on a good note, right? Club legend, he's been there for a long time, and you've mentioned it in past episodes, Jacob, that the one thing Carl hasn't been able to do is just get over the line, especially in finals and those clutch matches. I don't know, potentially can he produce a couple more miracles and do the unthinkable? But the main thing is for Adelaide fans that they're in this position. No, I didn't say they could. I'm just saying. I'm just putting it out there. And I wouldn't be surprised because it would just put egg on Jacob's face. It'd be pretty funny to see.
If the egg on my face is that Adelaide win the championship this year, I'm fine with that.
You're fine with it. I hope you are. I hope you're not slating them and saying, "Oh no, Adelaide shouldn't have won the grand final," this and that. But no, we'll see what happens anyway.
That's right. Well, you brought up Stefan Mork and his watch party. I thought that was quite a nice little moment there that he had with the playing group, inviting them all around. Seemed to be the leader of that there, wearing a Melbourne City top. Obviously, he's played for Melbourne City. He's played for about half the teams in the league, but a funny moment nonetheless. And actually, it was quite amusing at the end. He did another quick video after full time, and some of them were celebrating, but Jordan Elsey in particular did not look all that pleased with the prospect of having to play another game this season. Used some interesting language as the camera panned across to him. But I mean, we've got the stats here in front of us now in terms of sort of the Jekyll and Hyde situation that Adelaide have had this season. And interestingly enough, I'm pretty sure it's what I wrote might be the case in the season preview for this team, is that they could be very, very good or they could be very, very bad. And I think we've seen both sides of that coin dependent on the half of the season. In those first 12 games, 8-1, 3 drawn, only the 1 lost, taking over 2 points a game in that period. And then in the back half of the season, they played 14, lost 7 of them, lost more than half, only won 2 of them. Couldn't even scramble to a point a match. I guess it kind of depends on which team shows up, but Poletti, I'd be interested to hear, can Adelaide make any sort of mark in the finals, or are they just completely out of it now, given the form they've had in the back half of the season?
Look, anything can happen in a one-off game, but look, I think they're there just to make up the numbers. I think that much like the A-League women this year, it's very clear that there's a couple of top sides and then there's everyone else. There is a clear top part of the table, and then there's everyone else. And I think Adelaide just sit on the precipice of that. Yes, they've gotten into finals, but that's, Sydney fell away, MacArthur fell away. The Jets looked promising for a little bit, but then fell away as well, which I think we all expected at the start of the season. It's very clear there's Auckland, and then there's 2 through 5, and then there's everyone else, right? So I think you're looking at a situation where they're simply there to make up the numbers. It's going to be a tough trip to Iron Bark Fields for them. Maybe they extend their season to 120 minutes and penalties, in which case anything can happen if it gets to penalties. But I'm not convinced that they're even going to get to extra time.
Christian, you equally as pessimistic? I know Lockie is. He put a tweet out saying that it feels like any of the top 6 except Adelaide could go on and win the grand final. Do you share the same sort of opinion?
No, I don't. I think Adelaide's in with a real shot. I'm being honestly totally serious because
all right, so that's them done for the season then, based on your history with these sorts of things. Good to know.
I'm just saying you can't completely write them off, right? I mean, Western United, for as good as they've been this season, I think this matches up perfectly for Adelaide, right? I mean, if it was against, I don't know, an Auckland or a Melbourne City, for example, yes, I'd have very much less optimism for Adelaide to get something. But considering it's Western United, albeit away from home, they've showed, results that surprise us, right? I mean, drop points to Brisbane, for example, only a couple of weeks ago. Where did that come from? And finals football, it's an added pressure, right? And I think there are experienced players at Adelaide, right? Yes, it's known for its youth over the past years, but at the same time, they've got an experienced manager. They've got, a few players who know what it takes to win these types of games. So, look, put form out the window for these types of finals, one-off elimination games. I think Adelaide, seriously, they're in with a real shout. And it's going to go to Western United's ability to be able to manage the moments in these types of games. We haven't yet seen it. Yes, they won the championship a few years ago, but this is a different squad from that time. And we didn't expect this side to make finals, let's be honest. So they've got themselves a lot of youth. And I've always said that the wheels eventually, I think, are going to slowly start to fall off. We're going to see this side crumble a bit. And I think we're starting to see it over the past few weeks. And potentially Adelaide might be there to capitalise and get an unlikely victory.
Wow, that's a bold prediction, especially considering Western have just beaten Auckland 4-2, obviously. But no, I mean, look, I do agree that I think Western is probably the best matchup in that top 6 for Adelaide to have gotten. I think against any of the other sides, pretty foregone conclusion. City are just a much more controlling, mature side who are capable of just shutting games out. Victory have had Adelaide's number at least away from home for a number of years now, and the Wanderers are in good form as well. So yeah, I do agree it's probably the most favourable of the matchups, but I don't know. You all know I'm pessimistic, but it does seem like it's going to be a very difficult one for Adelaide in this elimination final. But a team that won't have to play an elimination final, of course, is Melbourne City, whose win against Sydney confirmed that they will be the Asian Champions League representative from the A-League for 2026. Obviously, Auckland won the league, but they can't participate in Asia. We know that, so it was whoever came second, and it was sort of that race between City and Western. City got the job done. They will be in the Champions League, and confirmed now every club that's going to be there. So City actually doing the double because they've got their women's side in it as well. So they're the first Australian club to get both their men's and women's into the Asian Champions League. And MacArthur, of course, winning the Australia Cup, will go into the ACL2. So Poletti, it's another chance in Asia for MacArthur. They obviously had to go out there last year, but were pipped by the Mariners in that final regional final, whatever it was called. I don't know. Lockie would know, but he's a nerd.
It was the Asian zonal semi-final, I think.
Yeah, something like that. But yeah, they'll get another chance. And City, it seems like perhaps one of the best choices in terms of resources, in terms of the squad that they've got, the coach that they've got, to make a decent run in Asia for Australia next year.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Melbourne City on the men's side, their last 2 Asian Champions League campaigns have seen them go undefeated through the group stage, but not make it out of the group stage, right? Like the advantage to this league phase, group stage, whatever you want to call it, is that if they go undefeated, they should go through. 8 draws should be enough to get them through. You'd back them to sneak a win or 2 in there. Double-digit points should secure advancement into the round of 16, and then you win 1 game and you're off to Saudi Arabia for to become the latest sacrificial lamb to whichever Saudi Arabian sides make it through to the knockouts, as we saw this year. MacArthur FC, I expect them to do a lot better. As Miele's press conference after the game on Saturday, was talking about, when I asked him, the lessons they learned are going to make him a little bit better. It'll help with squad recruitment a little bit as well. So hopefully they take those lessons and do well. And then Melbourne City on the A-League women's side, they've been the only representative of the Asian Women's Champions League for Australia, not including the preceding competitions, which have been different names. Oh, sorry, Lockie has just pointed out the City lost at home to Berth United. My apologies. I thought they'd gone undefeated across both their campaigns, but still only 1 defeat across 2 campaigns, and not getting out is absolutely insane. And Melbourne City on the women's side still have a chance to win it all this year. So, it'll be interesting to see what they do there. They could be the benchmark women's side in Asia, very similarly to how there is a side in Europe who are the benchmark women's side, where an Australian may or may not be coaching next year. just setting it up nicely, just teasing it along.
I do want to actually stick with you though, Poletti, because I want to talk more about MacArthur, right? Because they've had a tumultuous season in the league this season, both on and off the field, right, for different reasons. But it seems like if they can get some pieces together, there's some signs that there's a decent team there, right? And Stojovski's, had his moments of showing his prowess as a coach. Do you think that just a stable off-season for the club, a couple of key recruitments, do you think they can sort of at least match what Sydney were able to do in the ACL2 this season?
Oh, match, maybe not.
Or do you think that's maybe their ceiling is
I
getting
think
to the...
quarterfinals, maybe round of 16 if they draw a tough side. You got to remember, we talked about it. Everything fell for Sydney FC this season in the competition, but they did have to work hard for it. There was an extra time in Thailand, so they had to work hard for it in the knockouts to get to where they want. But then the dominoes sort of fell. Valeja Man coming back to help. His crosstown rivals from when he was at MacArthur. In that front. But I mean, I think they can make the knockouts. It's just who do they draw? How do they do it? What's Stojovski going to do in terms of recruitment? What are the club going to do in terms of the January transfer window? Are they going to look to sell again? That being said, you're not turning down some of the offers they got. Some of the numbers I heard were absolutely ridiculous. No A-League club can afford to turn those offers down, particularly given the state of play, as we know with MacArthur suing the FA. Clearly, they need the money. So, I think round of 16 quarterfinals, probably their ceiling. I trust Stojovski to do a very good job here. The crowds are starting to turn up. 9,213 now. At least 50% of that were Wanderers supporters. No one's under any sort of delusion that it wasn't. But it's the same thing when Sydney FC came to town earlier this year and it was 8,002. But this is a league-wide trend. And I had this discussion with someone earlier today, is teams aren't drawing crowds unless their rivals are coming into town. Outside of a Melbourne derby, when's the last time Melbourne Victory drew 20K? You go back 10 years ago, anything less than 20K would have been unfathomable for Melbourne Victory, bar, it being Orthodox Easter or something, something else big being on. Brisbane Roar are drawing a crowd regardless of who they play at home at the moment. The Mariners aren't drawing a crowd unless the Jets come to town. The Jets aren't drawing a crowd unless the Mariners come to town. The Wanderers aren't drawing... the Wanderers crowds have started to pick up in recent weeks, but that's because they're winning again. But other than that, they weren't drawing a crowd unless Sydney FC came across town, and vice versa. Sydney FC were barely lucky to crack 13, 14K at points this season, bar Melbourne Victory, Western Sydney Wanderers. The only side that has really continued to draw solid crowds, regardless of who is coming to town, is Adelaide. And that's because it's a much more condensed fan base. It's an appropriate sized stadium. So, the atmosphere looks bigger. You do have that genuine fear each week of, I need to get a ticket because otherwise there's a chance I might miss out sort of vibe. None of the other clubs in the league have that danger, particularly MacArthur, but, their fan base is growing regardless of, how many Wanderers fans actually turn up. And I want to see bigger crowds like this. I think there's a genuine chance we're going to get 10K for a MacArthur game next year, whether that be the Wanderers or Sydney FC. And let's just hope that if it is the Wanderers, that the RBB decide not to throw flares on the pitch again.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's talk about crowds, and we had it in the rundown a bit later on, but the numbers obviously in now for the regular season. We know the stats, an average of 8,788 for the regular season, which is up 3% on last season. So we're seeing year-on-year increases, but obviously you can't underestimate the impact that having Auckland in the league has had on those crowd numbers, obviously averaging 18,000. That's a nice boost, and I haven't done the maths myself, but I presume that without Auckland, it would likely be, about the same as last season or a little bit less. Sydney FC came in second. They've had some decent crowds, especially at the derbies. The United Round derby not included in those numbers, but they've been typically pretty consistent despite some, as we've discussed, some rather lackluster results this season. And then Melbourne Victory and Adelaide United rounding out the top four as you'd kind of expect, and the Wanderers then along in fifth. And you're right there, Poletti, that it really feels like there's not many crowds that are consistently doing a good job of pulling them in. We had Auckland this season, we had Adelaide this season, and it looked like the Wanderers are sort of starting to get back to it. So, Christian, do you think that, maybe it's all smoke and mirrors a little bit, this idea of we're getting a 3% crowd increase on last season, it's not actually as good as it sounds, and that, if you look at the numbers, perhaps maybe not actually a good season for crowds in the league?
I mean, you're right. Auckland make it probably better than it maybe turns out to be. I mean, it's an extra club helps, right, to add into the list. So obviously you take that any day of the week, and the crowd turnout in Auckland has been terrific week in, week out. They've shown that they've obviously been very loyal. But again, Jacob, you said before the pod recording that the test will come when the downtimes come, right? Will they keep turning up? It's only a sample of one season, right? So there's still, I guess, a lot more to learn about them. But obviously they've just been great in terms of the crowd turnout. And then, the other clubs, it's no secret that it's sort of gradually decreased in terms of, especially the big clubs like Sydney and Victory. The norm was a decade ago, for Victory, like Poletti said, at least 20,000, right? That was the minimum. That was their benchmark. And to drop significantly like they have, I mean, I remember a game against Macarthur earlier this season at home at Amy Park where it drew, I think, less than 10,000. And it was a Sunday afternoon, perfect weather, couldn't complain. That's just the perfect opportunity to just get the family out, get friends, watch a game of football, and couldn't even attract 10K. Like, this is just a stage that, unfortunately, where we find ourselves in at the moment. And the solutions are, I guess, up to the APL to try and find ways to improve that, but it just goes a lot deeper. It's very difficult to pinpoint something. It's accumulation of a lot of things. So, it's going to be fascinating to see next season whether that number does increase or whether it is just a false number in terms of, okay, it's another 3%, but are we actually getting anywhere, or does it actually look worse than what it is? So, I think time will tell.
And well, it's an interesting point you bring up there. Like, how do we increase this, right? Because it's constantly a discussion we're having about crowd numbers and, wish we could go back to the glory days, that sort of 2012 to 2016 period where, crowds were on the up. It was a great atmosphere. And, there are a couple of clubs that, did actually see some decent increases. Poletti, you mentioned Macarthur, obviously. Western United had a bit of a boost as well, probably helped by the fact that they've now got their home at Ironbark, even though it's supposedly temporary. And they're going to be building their new stadium, which we'll touch on a little bit later. But, they're up. The Jets as well had a bit of an increase, which is good. And, they were playing some good football. So, Poletti, do you think it's just a case of to get crowds, clubs just need to play better football? Or, I've seen some people suggest that ticket prices at some clubs are just way too high, and given the cost of living crisis that everybody's experiencing, it's unfeasible to justify spending that sort of money to go to football. Is it a case of, not backing the actives? You mentioned, obviously, that the RBB threw a flare onto the pitch, but, before that, they had flares in the stands. I thought it looked fantastic on the broadcast at the very least. It's when they step over that line, they throw it on the pitch. There's the problem. Do you think it's a combination of these things, or is there just one thing that you think will just really help out and that clubs should be doing already?
I don't think there's any sort of silver bullet that fixes this, right? You talk about that 3% year-on-year increase, but I mean, the positives there are great, but I mean, you can see that it had the potential to be so much more when you look at the numbers. Melbourne City down 27% in terms of crowds. Brisbane Roar down 18.5%. Now, I'm going to back Brisbane Roar fans there. I wouldn't want to turn up to watch that either. I mean, like seriously, I could not blame anyone for not wanting to go to watch a Brisbane Roar game this season. They've been absolutely dire. We'll get a little bit more into this in the season review, obviously, but they've been absolutely dire. their video analyst is a manager at a Pizza Hut. No, sorry, it wasn't a Pizza Hut, but a pizza
Unnamed
restaurant.
pizza restaurant.
An unnamed pizza restaurant per Ruben Zadkovich on Friday night, seemingly looking to just keep the excuses coming in the public eye, although he wouldn't dare say it's an excuse. He'd say it's just a reality or something like that. I mean, apparently now I get to be a video analyst in the A-Leagues. Like,
That's how it works.
all it takes is having experience running a pizza restaurant. Sign me up, A-Leagues. Like, come on, where's the club to sign me up?
Just the way he was lining that up.
Yeah.
The way he was lining that up in the press conference, it was like he was just waiting for that opportunity to just follow in his excuses.
It's when you get a really good anecdote,
you could
right?
tell.
And you're like, I have to say it, or you've got a good joke, and you're like, oh, I've got to tell this joke.
He was basically like, I don't really want to say, but okay, I'll say it anyway, just because I'll say it anyway. Yeah.
But then, I mean, you've got the Mariners down 11% as well, and they haven't been playing great football. So, it had the potential to be so much better. I don't know how the math works out, despite the fact I'm very good at maths. Probably it could have, had those teams just stayed steady, maybe you go, halve those drops. So we're looking at a 5% year-on-year increase, 6%, something that looks much better than 3%, so... the potential is there. I definitely think cost is an issue. I think timing of games is an issue. And I think I keep hearing these, the justification as to why the time slots are the way they are. But, I mean, bar this 2 Saturday games on the A-League men front, they're on a streaming service. Do we have to stick to traditional TV time slots on a streaming service? I don't think you do. I think you can get a little bit more creative with the times. Is there any reason we need to have 7:35 p.m. on a Friday night that would be perfect if the game was on free-to-air, but it's on a streaming service? And I know you want to have consistency week on week so that people know, okay, I can go to streaming service at Z time and I can watch an A-Leagues game. But there's almost no reason for it. I think you can get a little bit more flexible with it, particularly in summer where the temperatures just are absolutely insane. Is there any reason we need to be kicking off with 4 drinks breaks at 7 p.m. or 7:35 p.m. on a Friday night? There's no need for that. Push kickoff back half an hour. Sure, the crowd numbers might take a little bit of a hit, and we've just had this discussion about, we need to improve the crowd numbers and, everything like that. But if it, are those people just not going to watch if they're not going to the ground? Of course they're going to watch. You don't go...
People are more likely to turn up, right, if it's, half an hour later, but it's 10 degrees cooler.
Exactly.
Than sitting out there. Like that Adelaide and, was it Jets or Brisbane game earlier this season in 38-degree heat with 4 drinks breaks. And it's like, of course, nobody showed up for that game because they wouldn't. But if you delay it by an hour... I think we've
discovered something about the women's crowd numbers. But in seriousness, I think there is a chance to get a little bit creative here with the next TV deal and go, okay, well, can we experiment here a little bit? I mean, they don't kick off in Spain until 9 p.m. because why? It's hot. There's a reason that later kickoff times in certain parts of the world take place because it produces better football, and ultimately. That's how we're going to get bums on seats, is better football. That's how we're going to get more people watching on TV, is better football. I know that, to go back to COVID, numbers were more than likely up because no one could go anywhere. But you had winter. I don't think there's any, sort of coincidence here that there's a reason it was some of the best football that's been played in the league in that sort of shortened, 2-month window after COVID first hit, when they were forced to play later in the season, the temperatures were cooler. It was better football to watch because the players weren't battling 30 to 35 degree heat. And I'm not saying the switch to winter is the answer. We know that's probably not the answer, particularly while none of us own our own stadiums. And yes, Western United, I'm looking at you. You don't own your own stadium either. You own a training ground that just happens to have a 5,000 seat capacity. While no one owns their own stadiums, that's not a realistic option. So you've got to, just make it easier for people to tune in to watch better football.
Well, and while we're talking about scheduling games and things like that, we know the final schedule. So the next week, elimination finals are locked in. So it'll be Western United and Adelaide United. The United derby, perhaps, I don't know, maybe that's a bit of a stretch. It's going to be on Friday in Tarniet. Yes, pronounced Tarniet, not however it is that Lockie pronounces it. He was called out for that on social media, which I found quite funny. And then we have the Wanderers and Victory will be played on Saturday at Parramatta Stadium. Only that game is on free-to-air, the Wanderers Victory. Western and Adelaide is going to be exclusive to Paramount Plus. And we're going to preview those games in more detail on Friday. But while we're speaking of Western, and Poletti brought it up a couple of times there, stadium is obviously been a big talking point for them, and they've been in a lot of financial strife recently, as we've touched on in the pod. But last week we said that there was an imminent takeover of Western United that was in the works. No more than a few hours after that, the club announced the deal. So KAM Melbourne, a subsidiary of KAM Sports, run by the US Kaminsky family, and it's Mikhail Kaminsky, the CEO, has come out and said to Joey Lynch for ESPN, they spent about 100 million. For north of 65%. The investment is in WMG, the Western Melbourne Group. So that's not just Western United, the club. It also includes, obviously, those development rights around it, Christian. They've also promised to build the stadium as well. So it seems like, on surface, face value, really good news. But do even just a little bit of digging and some concerns start to bubble to the surface. KM Sport, they don't have the best record when it comes to takeovers of sporting clubs. They attempted to purchase Everton. They had rumoured interest in Atletico Madrid and other clubs across Europe, including in Belgium, Greece and Switzerland, and every single one of them has fallen through. And Kaminsky came out and said that each opportunity had particular circumstances which we were unable to overcome and complete the transaction. So, look, Christian, while it seemed like it was great news on the surface that they're out of this situation of financial uncertainty, and, like $100 million into the club is huge. There's a promise to build the stadium. Yes, we've heard that before, but, we're getting that promise again. But then, maybe it's going to be another case of those, owners coming into Australian football with perhaps not the best records, a la the 777 partners and Melbourne Victory.
Yeah, well, first of all, I hope Western United, they researched those, particular reasons why those deals fell through, right, with those clubs in Europe, because, it is quite worrying that they have had that track record. And I think at the same time, they're at such a desperate situation where they just need new owners, right, because of this transfer ban looming. If they didn't get the money to pay that transfer fee from Prijovic, then it basically would have been 3 transfer windows without being able to register any players, which would have been an absolute disaster for a club of Western United's size trying to rebuild for the future, which they already are, and they're doing a great job of that. You just have to go by this season, to see the improvement under John Aloisi, the development, the plan that they're trying to do. But look, that would have been disastrous. So I just hope the club haven't been pushed into a corner to say, okay, we've literally got no other option other than to accept this deal and just fingers crossed, hope for the best. I really like to think that they've really put a lot of work and research into this deal to really suit Western United in the long term, because that's what they are, right? This is a long-term vision with this new stadium approaching. They've got the new training facility, they've got Tarni, this project now. So it feels like everything is coming together. It's just the fans, like, they'd be a bit skeptical to say, okay, is this too good to be true? Is something dire going to happen? And, absolutely no one knew about the transfer saga that just hit on us a few days ago. That was an absolute bombshell, right? So, yes, that should, sort of go under the water, and it should be, all done and dusted, given this new ownership coming in, and they should settle it. But, I just hope from a Western United perspective and Australian football, because you don't want a club like that sort of going under and seeing more problems arise. So it's going to be a very nervous wait for fans, I think.
I will say, I'll add to this that as far as I'm aware, they do still have to go through some checks and balances. I believe it's the Foreign Investment Review Board or something similar to that, which will have a look at it. Pretty similar to how things are done for those familiar with takeovers in the UK as well, where they'll have an independent statutory body look over the deal and make sure there's nothing dodgy going on. But yeah, Poletti, look, if it is all cleared and they do get that 100 million in, yeah, it's a step perhaps, to sort of clear the club and get them moving back in the right direction. But it still feels like there's a lot of work to do to really capitalize on the potential that's there.
Yeah, look, and it's going to come with this stadium. It's going to come with basically clearing out all the debt from the club, or at the very least, KM Sport taking on that debt, which they seem prepared to do. They seem well aware of the situation based on what I've seen and what I've read. So I see absolutely no reason why Western United wouldn't thrive in this situation. Once this transfer ban situation sorts itself. I know Regaro was reporting last week it's something to do with Alexander Prijovic when he left the club. There's a dispute there, not too dissimilar to what happened with MacArthur and the situation around Dwight York. A paycheck simply clears that up, and so if they can get some money in, they can give whatever FIFA has decided that Prijovic is owed. They can go back to signing players, which will allow them to sell some of the players they've got under contract. I looked at the numbers last week. They've got 9 players out of contract at the end of this season. They've got a further 13 players out of contract at the end of next season. So if this transfer ban goes, that's 22 players out of contract that they literally cannot replace while they're in a transfer ban. That would almost render them incapable of competing in the league beyond next season until they got this ban, until they got this thing sorted, presuming they don't pay it off beforehand. So you'd imagine that they would do that. Whilst there's probably a couple more red flags than you would hope in a deal like this, I have no reason to believe that the likes of, the Foreign Investment Review Board, Football Australia and the APL wouldn't sign off it if it wasn't the best thing for Western United, because we cannot afford to lose another A-Leagues club.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I don't think there's a problem if it goes through, because I'm hoping that the regulatory system that's in place in Australia is good enough to catch any improprieties that might pop up, and it's going to be a good thing for the club and the league if it does. I think the worry comes if it doesn't go through, and that these red flags are warranted, and that then Western United sort of find themselves in that Newcastle Jets position of, is it just going to be a case of takeover after takeover fails for X, Y, Z reasons? So look, we're going to stay posted on that, and I'm sure we'll have more to report on as that progresses. But we'll keep talking about football. Let's go back to what this podcast is about. It's not about finance. It's not about numbers. It's about football. There were 2 other games played this round, of course. But did they really matter? What we can tell you, though, is that we know some games that will matter, and they will be the Australia Cup playoffs. They've all been settled, obviously, now that the season is done and dusted, and we know the finishing positions. They'll be held in Darwin between the elimination final and the first leg of the semi-finals. It'll be the Mariners against Perth on the Tuesday, the 13th of March, and then Wellington and Brisbane on Wednesday, the 14th of March. And Christian, look, we don't have relegation in Australia. The best we can do is to play off for the Cup. But I do think that there's still an importance to these games, because for a lot of teams, they'll base their pre-season around the Australia Cup and use that as really good prep work heading into the season to test things out against NPL opposition, against A-League opposition as well. So while it might seem like these are a little bit of a novelty and they don't matter, I think to clubs, coaches and players, that they have huge ramifications come the off-season based on how they then prepare to go for next season.
Well, if it's in March, like you said, the season will be already over, the Australia Cup. So they'll be hoping the games are in March. Obviously, you meant May.
May, yeah. I blame Lockie for that.
Always blame the producer.
Yeah.
Always blame him.
He's put it down. I've just read what's there.
Yeah, no, that's
I'm
fair.
not.
No, we have to forgive Lockie because he's sick apparently. So we've got to
I told you, he's big noted it.
Yeah, he's done that. He's done that to stitch me up. But no,
Anyway,
you're
though,
right, May. Yes.
I thought I'd note that down. But yeah, you're right. I think obviously it can be a very good indicator for pre-season, right? Because other clubs are going to obviously play the Australia Cup ties a bit later on. And so I guess it's a bit of an advantage for these teams who have finished sort of in that bottom section of the table to try out a few new players, experiment, rotate a bit, try out a few new tactics, and that's what you have to use it for, right? It's a competition where it's in the early stages. I mean, you can get some clubs where they might not take it as seriously as others. They might prioritize, squad selection, maybe embedding a few youngsters into the team. It just depends on the priorities, right? So you can definitely use it in different ways, but obviously these teams are there for a reason because they've performed very poorly throughout the season and they deserve that allocation.
Yeah, and I think as well, kind of the timing of it helps, right? In that we know we have a very long off season in Australian football in the first place. So, these teams that don't make finals and are in that real bottom part of the table, they still get that opportunity to have a game a bit later on in the season and stay perhaps a little bit fresher heading into the off season. But there's been news as well for the national teams, some conversation around the coaches. So, Poletti, I'm going to come to you for this one. Especially, you're going to have a lot of thoughts, I'm sure, about the first, which is Andy Harper on Saturday's broadcast mentioning that Joe Montemuro is seemingly locked in as the new Matildas coach. But we also have heard in the last couple of days that Graham Arnold has been tipped to take the Iraq national team job as well. So two very interesting appointments there, Poletti. What are your thoughts?
Right, I'm going to start with Graham Arnold first because
Good decision.
because maybe I'll run out of time before I actually have to talk about Joe Montemuro if I step paddle a little bit here. Look, this one definitely came out of nowhere. It's reported by Vince Rigari in the Sydney Morning Herald. Look, maybe, and so I put this on Blue Sky, but I'll treat our podcast listeners to it as well. Maybe white chicks had way too much of an influence on my childhood because when I saw this, my first thought was I can't remember his name, but it's the director of the FBI going to Kevin and Marcus, and I'm going to check with the bureau to see if they have any openings in Iraq. That was literally my first thought. So,
I'm not going to pretend to get that reference, but sure.
So yeah, maybe white chicks had a little bit too much of an influence on my childhood. But look, I think this is probably good for Graham Arnold. Get him back coaching on the national team. Might help spread the good word of the Aussie diaspora around Asia as well. Help us get a little bit more respect in Asia. And so from that perspective, I like it. And we get to Joe Montemuro. So the last time Andy Harper did this, from my recollection, where he just dropped it randomly in a broadcast, it was the Dwight York situation, where it was a Sydney FC Western United game that was taking place in Tasmania, and literally as him and Simon Hill are signing off from the Paramount broadcast, it's, by the way, I'm hearing that Dwight York has been sacked by MacArthur effective immediately. And then an hour and a half later, George Clark puts an FAAP. So, it's the last time he did this, it was on the money. So I have no reason not to believe he's on the money this time. And we'll get into this a lot more on the Dubcast this week, myself and Burke. We're going to have a lot of thoughts here. Look, the teaser I will give you for that is this should have been done 14 months ago. There is no need to take this out for this long. He was available 14 months ago. Unless there was something in Tony Gustafsson's contract which basically meant if he hit a certain target at the Paris Olympics that Football Australia were going to be forced to extend that contract. There was no reason not to at least sign Montemuro, even if you don't want to bring him until after the Olympics. Go, right, you're going to be the next coach. You'll commence on this date. Tony Gustafsson seeing us out to the Olympics, and then you'll come in afterwards, which is similar to what Sweden have done with Gustafsson here, is they've got their current coach who's seeing them through to the end of the Euros, and then Gustafsson's coming in, and his contract was announced 6 months out from the Euros. So it's not like it's a new phenomenon, and I mean, there were particularly after the World Cup, there were a number of times that Gustafsson was at least reported to want out of his contract. So I see absolutely no reason why. Just nothing about this makes sense. I don't like it. Look, I want Montemuro to do well if he is indeed going to be the next coach, because I want the Matildas to do well. I want Australian football to do well.
Yeah.
But I don't like it. I think this should have been done, over a year ago, or no, actually probably coming up on about a year ago now. This is, it's ridiculous that it's gotten to this point. And the fact that we're still probably trotting out Tom Samani for the next window at the end of the month is.
Well, I will add to that. Tom Samani was in attendance for the Adelaide United Melbourne victory women's semi-final first leg on the weekend. Not stupid enough to ask him about these rumours, though, so I can't give absolute confirmation on it. But Christian, part of football that you're going to enjoy here, Italian football, it always gets you up and about. Of course, there's been mentioned that Australia could become the first country to host a competitive match from Europe's top 5 leagues, obviously outside of, if that makes sense, you know what I'm saying. Optus Stadium is in line to host one or both of the Milan clubs in competitive fixtures for next season. This is according to Vince Rigari in the Sydney Morning Herald. Now, look, there's been a lot of talk in recent years about playing these domestic fixtures overseas. It's something Poletti and I are very well versed in with American sports. It seems to happen quite often there. But it really came to the forefront, was it 2018, with that Super Classico final in South America between River Plate and Boca Juniors, where the first leg was held in Argentina. Then there were fan troubles, so they moved it to Madrid for the second leg, and people weren't happy with that. And it seems like since then, this idea of having domestic fixtures played overseas has become sort of a very enticing thing for a lot of people, because countries are willing to offer up money for it. I'd be interested to get your perspective on it, Christian, because I'm sure you're happy at the prospect of being able to see some of these teams live in person in Australia. But are there any questions over competition integrity?
Look, it's because of a particular circumstance, right? So Milan are hosting the Winter Olympics over the January-February period. That's why this discussion has come about. If it wasn't for that, there's no chance this would happen, right? Both Milan clubs would want the games to be hosted at the San Siro. There's absolutely no chance whatsoever that the game would be played in Perth, right? So that's that done. I don't know what Poletti's reaction is.
You cannot believe what you just said, Christian. You absolutely cannot believe what you've just said. European clubs have been trying to do this for years. I know Jacob brought up the first time it happened, but they've been taking all their cup fixtures overseas, right? Like
I was about to get to that.
I'm saying the finals of the Coppa Italia have been in Saudi Arabia for how long? But to be fair, I have no issue with that, because it's a joke of a competition anyway. With the way the seeding and the draws and everything work out, it's not, But I mean, there've been pushes by La Liga clubs, by Serie A clubs, to take fixtures to the US for years, and they keep getting knocked back at every regulatory hurdle. So, yes, I know the Milan Olympics, the Milan Winter Olympics have, essentially forced this to happen, but is there no reason that Inter and AC could not just play away fixtures for a month? I see no reason why that couldn't happen. I think this is it's a situation where they've been given the green light to do it for a circumstance beyond their control, and they're just taking it with both hands because they want the money. If they've genuinely cared about keeping league fixtures in the country, and I'm not going to hear an argument for New Zealand. That's a different discussion here in terms of the way the A-League pans out. But if they could keep the fixtures in their country if they wanted to, and can front load or back load the schedule. South Melbourne front load their schedule in NPL Victoria, or back load. They do one of the two because of the F1 Grand Prix. They literally can't use their stadium for like a month, so they load their fixtures. There's absolutely no reason why they couldn't do this in Italy. It's literally all about the money. So I can't buy what you're selling, Christian.
No, but you didn't understand what I was saying. So I totally agree. But I'm just saying from the standpoint of this wouldn't have come about if it hadn't been for the Olympics, right? Maybe in the future, I haven't seen recent talks about Serie A. I don't know about the other leagues like the Premier League or La Liga, but for Serie A, in the short term, like recently, I haven't heard anything, right? Trying to move games overseas to America, Australia, anything like that. So that's all I'm saying. Like morally, I don't agree with it. I just think the game should be played domestically. I don't agree with this whole nonsense of, oh, you've got to try and promote the game here in America. It's not an American game. It's not an Australian game. It belongs in Italy, England, Spain.
Yeah.
These domestic countries, like these fans have paid memberships to go watch their teams play. I know it's a bit different for the NFL, for example. They've tried to experiment with games overseas. We're getting one in Australia at the MCG soon. But me personally, albeit, yes, I'm a massive Milan fan. I'll take it. I don't agree with it. And Perth, yes, it's the right decision if they do want to go ahead with it because it's obviously the closest distance in terms of travel. But then at the same time for Inter, because this doesn't concern Milan because we won't be qualifying for the Champions League. The Champions League fixtures will still be in January. I believe there'll still be a couple of fixtures there. So how that works, they have to play those games, Serie A, and then have to travel to Perth and then back to Italy. That's just going to be such a pain.
Perth to host a Champions League fixture. That would be crazy, hey?
Oh, imagine that. That would be absolutely insane. Okay, I'll be all for that. I'll change my opinion.
You'd be all
if that
for
happens,
that, wow.
if that
Even
happens,
if it was only Inter.
If it was only Inter, I don't care who it is. That would be awesome to see a Champions League game in a show. Who would have thought would be saying that? But no, like I said, I think the Olympics is the only reason why this discussion has been brought upon. I do agree with Poletti, though. It has sort of been simmering beneath the surface for a few leagues. I think La Liga has been the most outspoken in terms of them wanting to play games in America. They've been exploring that opportunity. But yeah, I mean, Serie A is used to this. Like Poletti mentioned before, Coppa Italia has been played overseas, the final in Saudi Arabia and China, the Super Cup as well in Saudi because of the TV rights of being sports. So economically, it makes a lot of sense. So yeah, I think if it does manage to pull off, then Perth have got a couple of great fixtures on their hands.
Yeah, there you go. Definitely an interesting scenario. And look, I think Australia is as good a choice as any country. Obviously, Eurovision, they're an honorary participant seemingly every single time that comes around. So you can consider Australia European at this point. But just before we finish up, we wrap up, I do want to mention as well somebody who's had a fantastic season so far. We spoke about Segacic, we spoke about Goodwin winning the Golden Boot, which is tremendous, but Marian Jakalic for Macarthur, a side that's significantly underperformed this season, is only the fourth player in the league's history to get double figures in both goals and assists in one season. Joins Craig Goodwin, Aaron Moy, and Marco Rojas as the only other three to do it. So a tremendous season from him after having quite a few critics of his own at last season, and he's been able to sort of renew his form and find some comfort there in Macarthur. So it's great to see these imports coming to Australia and doing well, and he has an Australian passport as well, so I'm sure he'll be a hot commodity moving forwards.
And he also might be close to a new contract if the reports from himself in last week's press conference are to be believed. He believes at least that him and Macarthur are very close to an agreement, so he'll be staying out in the southwest of Sydney. And some late breaking news. Ivan Franjic has tendered his resignation at the Melbourne Knights. So if you're listening, at this point of the podcast, you probably love your Australian football. Ivan Franjic has tendered his resignation at the Melbourne Knights. So the second NPL Victoria club currently without a coach.
Well, there you go. But that will do for our roundup of everything Australian football over the last few days on the Ramble Australia podcast. It's been good fun, even without Lockie here, me back in control of it all. So I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as we all did recording this. Thank you very much for joining me tonight, Christian.
Thank you, Jacob. A pleasure not having Lockie here. It was, great fun.
and leave comments as well saying how much better I am than Lockie too. That'll really make his day. And Poletti as well, thank you for joining me. Even though you're wearing that PSG shirt, it's been a pleasure to have you on.
I've always got to stir the pot whenever I can. I very much don't have a lot of chances to do it. In part because Lockie somewhat banned me from the podcast with how little I end up making appearances. But no, I absolutely enjoy coming on, and I can't wait to get this off and get back into an A-League shirt. Long live the A-League.
It's burning your skin. All right. Well, we'll be back on Friday with a preview of all the finals games. It's going to be a big weekend of football. So we'll hope to see you there. And once again, thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.